So our objective in this packet is to identify the various tissue layers and major organs that make up the GI system. So we're really going to get into the anatomy of the GI system, starting with the anatomy of the actual GI tube, what we call the alimentary canal or the GI tract, okay? But before we do that, let's talk about the overview of the processes that take place in the GI system. So basically, we know the function of the GI system. This is what nourishes the body. This is what brings in nutrients into the body via the mouth and the oral cavity. We consume most of our nutrients. They're usually too large to directly be transported into the bloodstream. And so they have to undergo digestion and absorption. Now, let's talk about the difference between digestion and absorption here briefly. So digestion is the process of actually breaking down food into smaller particles. Think about the process of chewing in the mouth. That is the first part of digestion. Think about the acid that's in the stomach. That is also digestion. The purpose of that acid is to break down those food particles to their smallest elements. And then food and the smaller food components, basically the smaller nutrients, can be absorbed once digestion takes place. So digestion followed by absorption are the first two processes that take place in the GI system. We also want to look at motility and secretion. So motility and secretion are also processes that are taking place that help to aid digestion and absorption. Motility is the movement, the rhythmic movement of the GI tract, starting again with the chewing of the mouth. That is a part of the motility. The peristalsis, which we'll talk about, which are the contractile waves of the GI system to help move food along. And then secretion is what we use to lubricate this content and move it along the tract as well. So motility and secretion are also helping to aid digestion and absorption because they're helping to lubricate the GI tract and move these food particles and eventually smaller nutrient particles along the GI system so that they can be absorbed in the distal parts of the GI tract, the intestines. So in our little schematic here, we can see those four processes. We can also see some of the main structural components of the GI system. We start off with the mouth and the oral cavity. We go through the esophagus, which connects the mouth to the stomach. We look at the stomach here, which is where most of the absorption really begins to take place. Some absorption happens in the mouth. We'll talk about what nutrients, what macromolecules are absorbed in the mouth, but for the most part, absorption really starts in the stomach. We've then got the intestines along with some of the accessory glands. So we'll talk about the liver, we'll talk about the pancreas, we'll talk about the gallbladder, some of the accessory structures to the intestines. And then we begin digestion. So digestion is really starting off in the small intestines. And then we have the excretion of feces, which are the waste products from this process, happening in the colon and eventually the rectum. Okay, and we can really see the four processes and where they take place. So digestion in the stomach and intestines, absorption taking place mostly in the intestine, so the absorption of those finer, smaller nutrients, and then secretion and motility happening throughout, which is what really helps to move food and other smaller particles through the system. Let's look at the divisions of the gastrointestinal system. So the GI tract is a hollow tube. It's about 15 feet long. It runs from the mouth through the pharynx, the esophagus, stomach, small intestines, colon, rectum, and anus, which we just kind of walked through. We also have some accessory glands here which secrete certain substances that aid these processes, either secretory fluids that have enzymes or mucus that just helps to lubricate. All of those are accessory glands that secrete their products to help with these processes, okay? And this schematic here just points out these structures. Again, we've got the salivary glands that are secreting mucus to help lubricate the oral cavity. We've got the pharynx, which communicates to the esophagus from the oral cavity. We've got the esophagus coming down here. We've got the stomach which is kind of sort of assorted to the left. We'll talk about the anatomy of these organs in this week's lab. So be sure to be connecting the anatomy with the physiology that we'll talk about today. And then obviously we have the intestines, the small intestines, the large intestines, which is also called the colon, and then the rectum and the anus, okay? So let's start off here by looking at the anatomy of this actual tract. And so because this is a hollow tube that runs from the mouth all the way down to the anus, we're gonna look at the layers of this tube. So if we took the tube itself and we cut it in a cross section, and we looked at the layers that constitute the tube, we would see the following layers with some modifications in different places. But these are the main elements of the GI tract, from the lumen out to the superficial layer of the tract itself. Okay. So again, we're looking here at the cross-sectional view of the GI tract from the lumen. So this is the lumen, all the way out to the superficial layer. And we're going to talk about the various layers here and the contents of each of those layers. So first off, from the lumen, we have the lining epithelium. Remember, epithelium is the lining tissue of all of our hollow organs, all of our internal body surfaces. And so the GI tract is no exception. It also has an epithelial surface that lines the inner layer of this tract. We've got the epithelial layer, then we also have a thinner layer outside, and then an even thicker, small, in relative terms, a thicker, small layer of muscle here, okay? And I'm gonna draw the muscle in red so that we can distinguish it from the epithelial surface. So these three layers form the mucosa, okay? So we've got the epithelial layer, we've got the lamina propria, and we have the muscularis mucosa, and together, all of these form the mucosa, okay? So, let's mention some of the contents of the lamina propria. Now, the lamina propria is the loose connective tissue of the epithelial layer. And so it's gonna have very tiny blood vessels, very tiny arteries, very tiny veins, and then very tiny nerves. Okay. Hopefully you can distinguish these colors. All right. And so I'll put here the contents of the lamina propria are small vessels and small nerves. And in brackets, I'm going to put LCT, which means loose connective tissue. So if you remember from the basic anatomy we talked about in our previous unit, an epithelial layer is avascular, so it doesn't have blood supply. So the underlying loose connective tissue is what actually supplies the epithelial layer. And so here in the lamina propria, this is where the vessels, the arteries, the veins, and the nerves that are supplying the epithelial layer, this is where they reside. So the epithelial layer, the lamina propria, and then the small strip of muscle, which is called the muscularis mucosa, All of these form the first part of the GI tract, which is called the mucosa. Okay. Now, outside of the mucosa, we have the submucosa. Oops. We have the submucosa. And the submucosa is another layer that has other arteries and veins and nerves. Now, these are the nerves that are actually moving the tube. These are the nerves that are going to be innervating the movement that help to create the peristaltic waves that move food along the tube, okay? We've also got nerves here as well. So this is called the submucosa. And the contents here are going to be large vessels along with large nerves. And the name of the nerves here are called the submucosal plexus. Also called the Meissner's plexus. Okay. So we have larger vessels in the submucosa. We have a more extensive nerves or networks of nerves that we call plexuses. And so they're called the submucosal plexus or the Meissner's plexus. And as I mentioned earlier, this is the autonomic nerves that actually create the innervation that moves food along the GI tract. Okay. Let's look at the second layer here. So we have the muscularis externa. So there's another layer of muscle. This is a bit of a thicker layer here. So we have the muscularis mucosae, which literally translates to the muscle of the mucosa. And then we have the muscularis externa, which translates to the external layer of muscle. So this is the muscularis externa. And here we have the Auerbach's plexus. So it's another plexus of nerves, but it's differently named. It's called the Auerbach's plexus. And again, here we also have the innervation of a thicker layer of muscle that is actually creating the rhythmic peristaltic contractions that move food along the tube. Now the final layer is a very thin layer. It's called the serosa. It's mainly connective tissue. Right, so it's a very thin layer called the serosa. And this is mainly a connective tissue layer. This can differ depending on where we are in the GI tract. So in the intestines, it's going to be more of a thin membrane that's called the the peritoneum. We'll talk about the peritoneum when we look at the GI organs, the anatomy. But the peritoneum is very similar to the pleural cavity, that very thin serous layer, or the pericardium that goes around the heart. And it's a similar one-cell layer thick membrane that creates lubrication for the movement of these organs. In the stomach and the esophagus, the serosa is a little bit thicker. It's an adventitious layer. We're not going to get into the details of that, but it's going to be thinner in the intestines and a bit thicker in the stomach and other parts of the GI. Okay, so these are the layers of the GI. We've got the mucosa, which is the inner lining. The epithelial layer is found here. The lamina propria is found here, the muscularis mucosa. We've got the submucosa, which has our bigger arteries, our bigger vessels, and our submucosal plexus. And then we have the muscularis externa, which is a thicker strip of smooth muscle. So remember, this is all smooth muscle. Make a note of that here. So this is going to be under our involuntary control. And so these nerve plexuses that we're speaking about are autonomic nerves, okay? So just bear that in mind. So those are the layers of the GI tract, and we're going to go on to really describe them in a more functional way as we go, as we continue on through the packet. Okay, so this will pretty much be a review of that. So we have the wall of the GI tract formed by the mucosa, which is the lining, the submucosa, which is a connective tissue layer, the muscularis externa, which has smooth muscle, and then the serosa, which is also connective tissue. And we can see those layers here as well. So we can see those layers, we can see some of the contents of the layers, right? And just like what we just drew. So we're going to go through each of these layers and talk about what the functions of these elements are. So the muscularis, the mucosa, excuse me, the mucous membrane of the GI tract, this is what pretty much separates the lumen from the internal environment. So this is that lining epithelium. This is what protects, let's say, the underlying tissues from the acid that's in the stomach, or from the nutrients that are coming in from our food, or any bacteria or pathogens. So this is what separates the lumen from our internal environment. And so this can also be thought of as a part of the immune system, a part of the defense mechanism of the body. Here we have cells that are called enterocytes. So these are the epithelial cells that are found here. And these cells are adapted in different ways, but they're mainly functioning to absorb. So they have absorptive properties. They can be exocrine cells. We'll talk about some of the exocrine cells, like the goblet cells that create mucus, or they can be endocrine cells that are creating hormones of the GI tract as well. So different parts of the tract have cells that are doing different things, but usually one of these three main functions. Here are the three layers of the mucosa. We just described them: the epithelial lining, the lamina propria, and the muscularis mucosa, which is the epithelial cells, the thin strip of connective tissue, and then the thin strip of smooth muscle, all forming the muscularis, the mucosa, excuse me, the mucosa. So the mucosa, again, the lamina propria layer of that, I won't spend too much time here because we just described this. This has smaller blood vessels, smaller nerves. It also has smaller lymphatic structures. So it has lymph nodules as well as the Peyer's patches. And the Peyer's patches is only found in the small intestines. And these are basically lymphatic aggregates that, again, are protecting the body from pathogens, bacteria, viruses, toxins that could be coming through from the external environment. So these are a function of the lymphatic system or the immune system. Okay, moving on to the third layer of the mucosa. So the muscularis mucosa, this is a thin strip of smooth muscle. This has longitudinal fibers along with circular fibers. And so the orientation of these fibers, they are longitudinal as well as circular, are helping with that mixing of the contents of the GI tract that I was describing earlier. So the thin strip of muscle here, this is what creates the mulching or mixing of the contents of the GI. And because the fibers are in different orientations, we're going to get squeezing of the tract in a circular manner. We're also going to get stretching of the tract in a longitudinal manner. Okay, the second major layer here, the submucosa, we describe this as being a thicker connective tissue layer. This has collagen. This is going to help with the distensibility, the elasticity, the stretch of the GI tract so that it can accommodate varying volumes of food and fluid. We also see larger blood vessels here, larger arteries, larger veins, larger lymphatic vessels as well. And then we also see the autonomic nervous system structures that I mentioned, the submucosal plexus, also called the Meissner's plexus, which is innervating this layer and helping with the secretion and the absorption and digestion of food particles that are coming through. The muscularis externa, again, is the thicker layer of smooth muscle. Here we once again see that the orientation of this muscle is in two different ways. We have an inner circular layer that can change the diameter of the tube. We have an outer longitudinal layer that can change the length of the tube. And then we also have another part of the autonomic system here, the myenteric plexus, also called the Auerbach's plexus. And before we move on to the serosa, just to kind of connect the function of the autonomic plexuses that are found here, if we think back to the autonomic nervous system that we talked about last semester, and we talked about how the parasympathetic system increased gastric secretions, increased the motility of the GI tract. This is where that innovation is brought about via these nerve plexuses. So the Auerbach's plexus as well as the submucosal plexus, both of those are parts of the enteric nervous system, which is another way of saying the autonomic nervous system. And that is how those autonomic functions are brought about in the GI system via these two nerve networks or nerve plexi. Okay, so let's talk about the final layer here, which is the serosa. And the serosa is the connective tissue layer. It's going to be that serosal layer, that thin layer of epithelium, also called the mesothelium. This is the same thing as the peritoneum. And then an inner thinner connective tissue layer. And I mentioned earlier that this can be different in different parts. So the outer layer of the stomach is going to look a little bit different from the outer layer of the small intestines, from the outer layer of the rectum, or the outer layer of the esophagus, right? So it's going to be a little bit of a thicker connective tissue layer in other parts of the GI, and a thinner layer that is continuous with the peritoneum when we come to the intestines. Okay. I'm not going to go over this again. We just talked about the order of structures, so I'm going to skip over that, but we're going to go through each of the structures and talk about the function of each of those parts. So we start off with the mouth. This is where digestion begins. We start with mastication, which simply means chewing or grinding of food. We also have the secretion of saliva from the salivary glands here. And the function of saliva is to lubricate the oral cavity, as well as to begin the breakdown of starch in the mouth. So starches or carbohydrates are unique in that their digestion actually starts in the mouth, whereas proteins and fats, the digestion begins later on in the stomach and the intestines. We also have the pharynx. Now the pharynx is commonly called the throat. This is the connection or the passageway that connects the oral cavity to the esophagus. This is actually a shared passageway, if you remember the anatomy from the respiratory system. We also have the passageway from the oral cavity and nasal cavity to the trachea. So the pharynx is really a shared passageway, and this is where we have the epiglottis, which is directing food specifically into the esophagus and not into the trachea. Okay. Then we move down into the esophagus. The esophagus is a hollow muscular tube connecting the pharynx to the stomach. It is partially made of skeletal muscle, so the upper 1/3 is skeletal muscle. The lower 2/3 is smooth muscle. So there's a gradual transition between where we can voluntarily control swallowing to where we cannot control swallowing because it's made of smooth muscle. We also have two sphincters located in the esophagus. The upper esophageal sphincter is skeletal muscle. This is the connection between the pharynx and the esophagus. This is under our voluntary control, so we can decide or choose to swallow something from our throat down into the beginning of the esophagus. But then the lower esophageal sphincter is purely smooth muscle. This is the connection between the esophagus and the stomach, and this we cannot voluntarily control, right? This is smooth muscle. The function of these two sphincters is to regulate the movement of food. So once again, as we chew and eat, food does not just kind of flow down into the esophagus. We have to decide to swallow. So we have to decide to open this first sphincter. Likewise, as we get down to the distal part of the esophagus, food is not just flowing into the stomach. It has to be released into the stomach in a regulated or in a controlled manner. And that is the purpose of that sphincter, kind of being a gatekeeper or regulating the flow of food from the esophagus into the stomach. Okay, moving down into the stomach. So the stomach has a function of pretty much storing food after it's swallowed and accommodating the entirety of all that we've eaten as it is acted upon by the gastric juices, by the acid that's in the stomach. Now, when the stomach is empty, it's holding about 50 milliliters, and it can completely expand to accommodate as large as 1,000 milliliters when it's full. And this is very variable from individual to individual. So if you're, excuse me, if you're chronically eating excess quantities of food, your stomach can stretch to be 2 times, 3 times the highest volume. Whereas if you eat, smaller portions, your stomach can also contract to accommodate a smaller volume of food as well. And this also plays into the hormones that control our satiety when we're satiated and when we're hungry, because there are stretch receptors in the stomach that are responding to whether our stomach is empty or full. The stomach also functions to secrete gastric juices, which are acidic juices that help to begin the breakdown of proteins and fats and continue the breakdown of carbohydrates and starches. Now, food is slowly released from the stomach into the small intestines via the pyloric sphincter. So at the end of the stomach, there's another sphincter that is regulating the release of contents from the stomach into the intestines as well. Let's talk about the parts of the stomach. So the stomach has the fundus, which is this top portion here. It has the body, which is pretty much all of the rest of the structure. It has the antrum, and the antrum is the distal part of the stomach that eventually becomes the pylorus. And then it has the greater and lesser curvature. So the greater and lesser curvature aren't being showed here. We'll talk about them in the lab, but the greater curvature is the outer curvature of the stomach, and the lesser curvature is the inner curvature here. And then we also want to point out the pyloric sphincter, which is found around the pylorus, and then the lower esophageal sphincter, which is found at the distal part of the esophagus. So basically the stomach is contracting to mix together the semi-solid content, which is now called chyme or chyme. So once we've begun breaking down that food, once the acid has begun digesting those larger food particles, and it now becomes a semi-solid kind of liquidy component, we now call it chyme, and it can be moved through the pylorus and enter the intestines. Other features of the stomach are rugae. So rugae are these folds that are found throughout the stomach lining. They have the ability to stretch out and allow the stomach to distend to accommodate larger volumes, as well as to contract or fold upon themselves to allow the stomach to come back to its original size and original shape. Okay, another really important feature histologically of the stomach are called the gastric pits. Now, the gastric pits are these pits or glands that are found throughout the stomach lining. And these are these hollow structures that go really deep that help to secrete certain products onto the stomach surface. There are also certain cells that line these pits. So as you can see here, this is one of the pits. This is called a pit or gastric gland. And as you can see, there are certain cells that are lining this pit that are secreting different surfaces that will make their way onto the stomach surface. So pepsinogen is one of these stomach surfaces, one of the contents that are secreted by stomach cells. Pepsinogen is secreted by the chief cells that are lining the gastric glands. And the function of pepsinogen is to be a precursor to pepsin, and pepsin is going to begin the breakdown of proteins, all right? So chief cells, one of the cells that are lining the glands, as we can see here, secretes pepsinogen, and then pepsinogen will then become activated by hydrochloric acid, which I'll talk about on the next slide, to begin to break down the proteins that are found in the food that's sitting in the stomach. Hydrogen ions is another substance that is being secreted, another secretory product here. This is secreted by another cell of the gastric gland. This is called the parietal cell, and this helps to maintain the acidic environment of the stomach. So remember, hydrogen ions, we talked about them earlier. These are what create that acidic environment. And this is what helps to break down food in the stomach, but also act as a part of the immune system. So the acidity of the stomach is also acting as an immune mediator by destroying any bacteria, pathogens, toxins, viruses that may be ingested in the food that we eat. So it's also part of the body's defense mechanism. The parietal cells also have another role, so they not only secrete hydrogen ions, but they also secrete something called intrinsic factor. And intrinsic factor is necessary for the absorption of vitamin B12, one of our water-soluble B vitamins. So people who have stomach surgery or removal of parts of the stomach, gastric bypass is what that is called, usually have to supplement vitamin B12 and other vitamins, but importantly vitamin B12 for the rest of their life, because the absorption of these vitamins are dependent upon some of the cells of the stomach, the parietal cells, and intrinsic factor. We also have gastrin secreted from G cells. So G cells are another cell type that's found here. And gastrin is going to play a role in our hunger function, as well as mucus cells, which are called neck cells. And these are found higher up in the neck of the gastric gland. So we can talk about different parts of the gland. We can talk about the pit down here, and we can talk about the neck of the gland, and these are where the mucus cells are found, and they secrete mucus into the stomach surface, and that mucus is helping to lubricate the stomach, but also helping to protect the underlying layers of the stomach lining from the harsh acidity of the gastric contents. Okay, so kind of protecting the underlying tissues from the harshness of the acid in the stomach. All right, so the acidic environment of the stomach is usually around a pH of 2. So as we can see, that's really acidic, and this is needed to activate pepsinogen into its active form, pepsin, so that it can begin to break down protein in these stomach contents. Now, as you would imagine, this acidic pH will denature proteins, but also kill bacteria, kill viruses, or neutralize toxins, that would be found in the stomach contents. There is a gastric mucosal barrier that is created by the mucus as well as bicarbonate. We'll talk about bicarbonate in the small intestines, but this barrier helps to protect the stomach lining from the acidic environment of this kind. And it also helps to protect our proteins in our body from being denatured in this acidic environment. And that mucus is created from the neck cells, which I pointed out earlier, but also from goblet cells, which are found in other parts of the intestine as well. Alrighty, let's move on to the small intestine here. So the small intestine is a continuation of the stomach that leads to the colon. It's a coiled hollow tube. It's about 8 to 10 feet long, and it's the primary site of digestion and absorption as well. There are 3 parts to the small intestine. There's the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum that are all playing a role in absorption. There's also the input that's coming in from pancreatic juices. So there are pancreatic juices that are entering the duodenum. We'll talk about the structures that are used to secrete these juices into the intestines. But the function of these juices is to help with that digestion as well. There are digestive enzymes that are being released here. There's also bicarbonate that's helping to neutralize the acidity of the chyme that's coming in from the stomach. So remember, the contents that are coming down from the stomach to the intestines are very highly acidic. And so we want to start neutralizing that acidity by secreting bicarbonate into the lumen of the intestine, which will help to neutralize that chyme. We also have bile. So bile is coming into the duodenum from the gallbladder. So bile is made in the liver, but it's being secreted from the liver and stored in the gallbladder until we have a meal that requires bile. And then those bile salts can begin to digest fats in the small intestine. So upon having a fat-heavy meal or a meal that has lots of fat in it, the gallbladder will begin to contract and will release that bile into the duodenum so that it can begin to emulsify fats. We'll talk about the function of how bile acts on fats later on, but bile is emulsifying or breaking